This morning I'm going to cover the political situation in the UK and Brexit, and at the end take questions, so don't be shy. I don't know everything, but I can have a good crack at what likely answers or likely possibilities will be. So, moving swiftly on, I thought I'd run through the political parties and their current state and how they're likely to develop, change, move forward, etc. First of all, with the Conservative Party, for those of you who have been under a rock, they currently have a leadership election at the moment. Two candidates, which I'll cover in more detail in a minute. They are likely to, that should strengthen their position in the polls. To be honest, it couldn't make them any worse, arguably. I'll come on to them in more detail, but Labour, probably spend a little bit of time so that you understand the workings of the Labour Party under Comrade Jeremy Corbyn. For those of you who are not Leninist or Marxist or communist by persuasion and historically, Jeremy is not the brains of the operation. The brains of the operation from an economic point of view, industrial point of view, is John McDonnell. Quite a lot of policies have been published in respect of nationalising various industries. That will carry on. There'll be more meat put on the bones of that strategy. But what I would say is that if Labour do get into power, everything will be done within 12 months, so there will not be time taken to think about things. It will be done immediately, so that's something to bear in mind when you look at nationalisation of industries, increasing corporation tax, etc., etc. And those are, when you have a look at Labour's policies, those are quite a lot of areas which impact on your business on a day-to-day basis. So that's something to think about. John McDonnell will cover off economic policy and run, if you like, UK policy. Internationally, a man called Seamus Milne will be shaping the direction, engaging internationally with the Americans, with the Russians, Chinese, etc. And that will shape the dynamic of Labour's foreign policy. If Comrade Jeremy was to fall under the number 24 Clapham omnibus, the likely replacements are probably, and I say this probably, per any one of three potential female candidates, and that's Emily Thornberry, currently Shadow Foreign Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, currently Shadow Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary of State, and Angela Rayner, currently Shadow Education Secretary. I wouldn't like to pick a winner from that, but I would suggest those would be the three candidates, and it will be one of those that succeeds Jeremy. If we come on to the Liberal Democrats, they are currently having a leadership election. It seems very fashionable at the moment. Jo Swinson against Ed Davey. I think, according to the bookmakers, Jo Swinson is the favourite. I think she will win. That could be, challenged by Chuka Umunna arriving in the Liberal Democrats and fancying a crack at the leadership as well. I jest. I think Jo Swinson will win, and she will be the next leader moving forward. I think the local government elections and the European elections were a fantastic uplift for the Lib Dems, despite, Savins Cable's very, very high-profile leadership. They still managed to do well in the European elections and the local government elections. And that will continue, I think, when they are seen as a pro-Remain party. That picks up disaffected Labour people who are not either supportive of Labour, supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, and his position on Europe. The Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, the party is well funded. It has a charismatic leader. It has no manifesto. You don't need one when you have one policy to deliver Brexit and to get out of Europe. And he will, as long as he stays focused, they will be successful. Now, will they be successful at a general election? Well, if the evidence of the Peterborough by-election is anything to go by, they will struggle at a general election. They may win by-elections in the future, but I think in a general election to win individual seats under a first-past-the-post system is very, very difficult for the Brexit Party. But they will take sizable chunks of the vote from potentially the Conservatives and disaffected Labour people on Brexit if there was to be a general election. More of that later. The SNP are still remaining pretty strong. Alex Salmond is in court. I won't say anything about that for fear of ending up in clink myself. The Labour Party in Scotland suffered badly in the recent European elections. The SNP are relatively strong still. Their messages on Europe and potentially a future independence referendum strengthen their hand, and I see that moving ahead in terms of Scottish Parliament elections and future general elections in Scotland. Now, what you'd always wanted to know this morning was who will be the next Prime Minister after Theresa May. I think if I'm a betting man, I would say 3 weeks ago, Boris Johnson at the bookmakers was 5-1 on, and in bookmaking terms, that's as close to a cert as you can possibly get. The price has drifted a bit, you know. Boris is running an interesting campaign, domestic issues, and surprisingly waffly and blustery on policy detail about how we'll get out of the EU and what his Brexit policy is. In the end, I think he will be elected, but you know, we have just under 5 weeks for Boris to claim defeat from the jaws of victory. I don't think it will happen, but you know, anything's possible. Let's cover Boris's strengths and weaknesses. His strengths, first of all, are that he is charismatic, he's a celebrity, he has voter appeal in respect of they recognise him, they know who he is, and he has won the London mayoral election twice in a Labour city against a relatively strong Ken Livingstone initially at the time. So he has success, he has electoral success, and he led the Brexit campaign, which was a victorious campaign. So arguably, it should be him that leads the Conservatives out. His weaknesses, I don't think we've got long enough. His weaknesses are he is lazy, he doesn't do detail very well, he blusters and occasionally reads his brief and can get it wrong way round. The evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee on Nazanin Zahawi Radcliffe being the prime example. Whatever you say, let's put Brexit to one side. If he is Prime Minister, it will be eventful, and his shtick will be bluster and it'll be all right, trust me. That will be the shtick. He has no overarching grand plan, apart from a bit like Nigel Farage, getting us out of the EU and delivering Brexit. The only policy he's come out with at the moment is a tax cut for high earners, which clearly impacts on all you guys and girls, and is very welcomed. But that's it. There is no overarching manifesto, policy agenda that he has, and his overriding objective is to get into number 10. And often you find people whose overriding objective is to get to a certain position don't last there that long, because once they've got there, they don't know what to do, or they haven't a plan which lasts long term. If we go on to Jeremy Hunt secondly, just in case he is the next Prime Minister, I caveat, like all good presenters and commentators, he will be more of the status quo. If you'd have said 2 years ago, Jeremy Hunt, Secretary of State of Health, former Secretary of State at Culture, Media and Sport, will be down to the next 2 with a serious chance of being Prime Minister, I would have taken lots of bets on that. But here we are, it's funny political times. And he is seen as the safe pair of hands moving forward. So he will read his brief. He'll be reasonable, conciliatory. And again, you've got to remember the Conservatives effectively have been in office for 9 years. Their policy agenda from 2010 was delivered. The manifesto that Theresa May stood on in 2017, most of it has been junked, some during the campaign. There is nothing in terms of policy there to deliver, so it will be up to Jeremy Hunt and Boris to come up with new detail, and that will be the hard thing to do, to reinvent yourself in office. What type of administrations will there be? Well, I've said Boris will be chaotic, blustery, leaping from one thing to the next. Jeremy Hunt will be Conservative with a small c, boring, predictable. There'll be no setting the heather alight. You'll know what you get, and it'll be safe for however long they are there. Now, Theresa May's strategy, people often ask, what actually was her strategy? And her strategy is difficult to fathom, really. There are a number of things went wrong. I think, first of all, and you hear it in the press quite often, saying she trusted her civil servants too much. Well, yes, but it's the politician's decision, because civil servants is like a Rolls Royce. As a minister, all you have to do is drive it, usually in the direction you want to go, not, down a lay-by, into a cul-de-sac, etc. The instructions she gave civil servants were clear, and they delivered on those. The red lines, sorry about that, the red lines. What she missed was the political analysis of, okay, this is what the Europeans will offer. Okay, I'll accept that, without looking behind her and thinking, can I get the votes for this? And that's basic in a politician. There's no point, if your management agreeing a deal with the trade unions, or a trade union agreeing a deal with management on pay, luncheon vouchers, etc., there's no point agreeing something that, management a 10% increase, and you take that back to the board and say, no way. Trade union taking it back to your members and saying, I've agreed for a 2% wage cut over 2 years, and the members say, no way. It's the politician's job, and she's the only Prime Minister I know who has gone over to Brussels, signed a deal, brought it back, and then realised she can't get it through. And it's not because she wasn't advised. Her cabinet advised her, her senior advisors advised her. And people say, Theresa doesn't listen. She does listen, but she never responds. So you would have a cabinet meeting, and I know this from speaking to cabinet ministers and advisors. They would listen, or she would listen to them, but not actually say, okay, we'll do this. So they would leave the cabinet and be none the wiser as to what the actual strategy was. And that's the same with advisors. And that's what, you'll hear it in biographies moving forward. It drives politicians and advisors up the wall because there's no clear sense of direction. So I would say, and I caveat, up to now in my lifetime, I was born just after the Second World War, she's been the worst Prime Minister we've had in terms of operational standards in office. And, we've all avoided Gordon Brown's flying telephones and things like that. But in terms of actual prime ministerial office, she's been the worst. I caveat that up to now because clearly we may have someone else in number 10 quite soon who wants to challenge that record. The next Conservative leader's strategy, let's take a wild guess, looking at the bookmakers, and say that Boris, rides into number 10 on the 25th of July. his strategy will be to go over to the EU and say, look, I want to negotiate on X, Y, and Z. They will say, okay, let's have a chat. But there will be, one, short of time because the European Union have got a new commission. They haven't got a negotiating counterparty. So Barnier's team is disbanded. Barnier is still around, but it's disbanded. So in the time that's available from the 25th of July, it's very, very unlikely that the EU will rustle up a deal or Boris will rustle up a deal with the EU. He will then come back and say, I can't do a deal with the EU, but I'm committed to taking the UK out. So I'm going to take the UK out on the 31st of October without a withdrawal agreement. Parliament will say, up with that we will not put, and I say that that's Labour MPs and a sizable chunk of Conservative MPs. I just point out to you that Boris won 160 MPs who nominated him. 152 Conservative MPs didn't nominate him. They either supported Jeremy Hunt or Michael Gove, and that when Boris was nailed on to be the next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, with all the power of patronage in terms of government jobs, other, delegations to X, Y, and Z, they went, sod that, we don't want Boris, we want someone else. So to say he's got a united backbenches behind him is not true. He's got a split Conservative Party, and some of those MPs who are pro a second referendum on the Conservative benches, I think will be joined by some very big hitters. I raise Philip Hammond as an example. I raise David Gauke, Secretary of State for Justice, as another example. So I think no deal will not be allowed to get through the House of Commons. So if you're Boris and your shtick is to get us out on the 31st of October, come what may, with deal preferably, or without a deal, what do you do? Because you're stuck. I think there will be an extension for however long, 3-6 months, and Boris will say, I'm going to call a general election, because that's the only way to break the impasse. Or a referendum. This is all with the backdrop of the next DUP deal. As Ken Clarke says, you can always do a deal with an Ulsterman. They are very keen to do a deal. There's a couple of billion quid on the table. The issue for them is the backstop and the Conservatives supporting that backstop. That is on the table for agreement with the New Deal. And they will wait till there's a new Conservative Prime Minister who will say, I will not accept the backstop, and then expect that deal in terms of votes to be done, because it also guarantees the money gets delivered. Brexit possibilities. Deal, I think, very, very unlikely. I'm not running a book afterwards, so don't plough in with your hard-earned ACCAs. Very unlikely in the short term. No deal, an increased possibility with, for example, someone like Boris Johnson, but in reality, the mathematics and the House of Commons don't allow that. Article 50 extension, unlikely. I don't think either party would like to be seen to be doing that. I think it's more likely that an extension with the EU in the short term is the way forward. A new referendum, well, certainly the Conservatives won't support that, and Labour will support it, but haven't got the majority to get that through. General election, I think, is where we're at. Boris will look at the opportunities for that, which are money will go into the Conservative Party because Boris is the leader. They will have the organisation. He'll look at the polls. There will be a poll bounce. Every new leader has a honeymoon period. He will have stuck to what he said, loosely, in a blustery kind of way. And he'll say, I can't get it through. I'm going to the country. You say, get me, and I'll get us out of the EU. And that will be his shtick in the general election. So if you think 31st of October, no deal, no deal, general election either later this year or in the spring. Quickly, just in case there is a referendum, we like to cover all bases, in case you invite me next year and say, what happened with that referendum, John, that you didn't predict? The question is, what questions would you ask? Is it yes, no, as we had before? Is it, very unlikely, Theresa May's deal or stay in? Or is it 2 or 3 questions, leave, remain with a deal, X, Y, and Z? The current political opinion polls, and they fluctuate, but it's still 50-50. It's not 65 leave, 35 remain. It's not 65 remain, 35 leave. So if you were to have a referendum, and I don't advocate this strategy, and, for example, Remain were to win 52-48, I think if I was Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson or someone else, I'd be saying, well, best of 3. Let's have another crack. I think if you're having a referendum, you need it to be a chunky threshold. 65% gives a clear 65% gives a clear decision one way or the other. 52-48, pretty close. So that's where we are. Now, questions. I'm very happy to take questions. I may have missed, a particular party that someone has a close affiliation to. The Green Party, or yes, a Green Party member. Don't worry, they did that because they were scared of hecklers. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Clearly you've not heard me before, but the ones that aren't here had heard me before.
No. Oh, there we are. Okay, it's a bit of a nerdy question. Mike Dobson from Confederation of Paper Industries Trade Association. Just interested in your thoughts on Michael Gove. Clearly he has gone to try to be Prime Minister, has failed. Boris has got one over on him. I would think it's fair to say that since he's been in his position at the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs as Secretary of State, he's put a lot of work in and done quite a lot of good things, and obviously there's still quite a long way to go. Do you think that if we assume that Boris does become Prime Minister, he would still have a place for Michael Gove in his cabinet, whatever it may be, or do you think it will be, we've definitely got one over in you and I'm seeing it right through, you're finished, mate?
Yes, good question. Well, Boris has a little bit of a problem with the cabinet and ministerial positions because he's been quite, it's a bit like drunk Father Christmas. He's given out a lot of sweeties and a lot of presents early doors. So, for example, there are 3 people who fancy their chances of being the next Chancellor. Liz Truss, Sajid Javid, and Michael Gove. And that's just 3. 4 if you include Matt Hancock. So Boris has promised it to 3. Matt Hancock, Sajid Javid and Liz Truss. Michael Gove would like to be Chancellor. I suspect, and don't quote me on this, that he may not serve in Boris's cabinet. They really don't get on. I mean, when I say don't get on, they do not get on. If Michael Gove had been one of the two to go to the shortlist, it would have been a fantastic fight fest. If you're an all-in wrestler or combat, because Michael Gove would have been forensic, and particularly in one-to-one debates, he would have stripped Boris Johnson alive. In a funny way, it's sort of a shame. He could have possibly won, because I think when people see Michael Gove, he's bright, he's articulate. Hopefully there's no teachers in here this morning, but apart from teachers, at DEFRA, he gripped a department where ministers go to die in terms of careers, and he made it a green department. And over an 18-month period, he has re-energized it. And that is down to Michael Gove. If he had been the Conservative Party leader, you would have got a sense of direction smacked with reality, and he would have actually said what he could and couldn't do, whereas Boris's bluster. My gut says that Michael Gove will think this is going to be, one of the worst battles of Vietnam. I'm not going to be part of it. I'll sit on the side and wait my time.
I think it's on, right? Okay. So a question with regard to the political parties, and what you see happening, at least in my view, is that parties start to split even within the parties themselves. So you have a Conservative party that is no longer one monolithic bloc. I mean, you have people that like to get out of the EU as quickly as possible. Other ones want to stay in. You see the very same happening in Labour. So the traditional way in which the political parties in the UK used to be organized, along class, for example, that seems to fall apart. And it seems to be a lot more defining whether or not you are pro or against staying in the European Union and the like. How do you see that play out going forward in the political landscape? Would political parties start to disintegrate, new parties start to emerge? Because what is still holding a party like the Conservatives or Labour together with so many different opinions about key topics like the EU and other cultural issues?
Okay, I think let's start with Labour. That's slightly easier. Labour will get to a pro-referendum, pro-Remain position. 90% of the Labour Party members are pro-Remain. I would say 75% of the MPs are pro-Remain. You may hear some Labour MPs who aren't on the television and doing media, and they represent constituencies where the vote was quite sizably to leave. They are worried about not being the MP after an extra election. That is what is driving their position on that. It's, if you like, narrow self-interest. So I would say, if you look at the success of the Change UK, Labour MPs who left, and the demise of that party, it's allowed a lot of Labour MPs to wise up that the grass isn't greener, and people always fail to forget to look back at history. When the SDP was created in 1981, it had big names. It had David Owen, Shirley Williams, Roy Jenkins, and half a name in Bill Rogers. It had money, it had MPs flocking to it, yet it didn't make a breakthrough because it didn't have the organisation on an individual constituency level, and over time it had to merge with the Lib Dems. A new party is very difficult to sustain. It's easy to do at European elections with one issue for Nigel Farage. It's very difficult to do for Westminster. So I would say at the moment, I think Labour will come back together around a Remain position with some MPs vocal, but a minority in opposing that. The Conservative members, I think 90% are to leave the EU, and when I say leave the EU, whether you've got a deal, whether you've not got a deal, we just want to leave the EU. It's becoming a touchstone issue. So Conservative MPs go back to their constituency associations and face that on a Saturday night at the barbecue through the summer. And that is an issue for the Conservatives. I think there will be a core of Conservatives, and I think that will grow, who are probably not as pro-EU as Ken Clarke, but in that, and I include people like Philip Hammond, David Gauke in that, who are more concerned about the damage done from a no-deal departure from the EU. And that will be, unless they're deselected as candidates, which is a possibility, but doubtful, then the Conservative Party for a period of time will not be united. Now, in terms of a general election, the polls go up and down. So the next question would be, if there was a general election, let's say in November, would Comrade Jeremy win, or would Bonking Boris win? And it depends. It depends. It really does depend. It's too difficult to predict. It could be that Boris comes back with a 50-seat majority. It could be that Jeremy walks down number 10 with a coalition of the Lib Dems, the SNP and the Green Party, not in a formal structure, but in a loose coalition. And what I'll say about the Labour Party, they will never be beaten from the left by the Green Party, the SNP or the Lib Dems. Unlikely to be beaten from the left from the Lib Dems, but possible. So whatever they do, it will drive them to the left. So their agenda, it won't be watered down, it'll be toughened up. So in terms of nationalisation, etc., etc.
Hi. If we do go for a general election, will Jeremy Corbyn still be the leader of the Labour Party? Or would there be a process that maybe realise that he's not as electable as maybe some of the MPs may be within the Labour Party? I don't know what the Labour Party process is for that.
In my experience of politicians, self-awareness is not one of the top feats. So blindingly obvious to all of us that potentially, a more mainstream leader could potentially smash the Conservatives, given how weak they've been over the last 2 or 3 years. Jeremy Corbyn will take Labour into another general election. He controls the members. I would say less control of the members than there used to be. He controls the unions, Unite particularly. He controls the National Executive Committee, and he doesn't control the MPs, but they tried to take him out once and it didn't work too well. So, yeah, absolutely, he will be the candidate to take, unless something happens, he has a gardening accident or, the allotment goes wrong or something. That's the only reason he won't go in. And if he wasn't the leader, it would be one of the 3 candidates that I've mentioned before.
Hi. Obviously, you slightly touched on the Green Party earlier, but didn't really expand much on that. I wanted to hear your opinion on the Green Party because I'm becoming more of an advocate for it, because I just think the other parties are becoming a little bit of a joke. I've always been fairly left-wing, but obviously Jeremy Corbyn, I just find him a bit of a joke. So, yeah, I'd like to hear your opinion on the Green Party.
I knew I should have done a slide on the Green Party. What do I think? I think in terms of Westminster elections, they have the potential to win 1 or 2 seats where it's a particularly green. For example, Brighton is a possibility. It's unlikely to see them breaking through on a sizable proportion of seats. The potential to win by-elections is there, but the potential to grow from the ground in winning council seats and doing well, if there are any more European elections, to do well there, I think. But I would say if Labour were to win or were to be part of a government, then the Green Party is quite likely to be involved in that. And that would shape policy quite strongly, I think. So moving forward, I think the profile is going to increase. They'll win council seats, not so many Westminster seats, but their power in Westminster, as long as they have an MP, they'll be punching well above their weight.
Good morning, John. I'm curious to get your views on how far the Liberal Democrats can push forwards after their recent showing in the European elections, and have they got the infrastructure and support to stay as a more solid party that's going to attract a broader base and make a difference?
Okay, two things there. The first thing is Labour's position on Remain. If Labour adopts a referendum and Remain position, that will take some of the Lib Dem protest votes that they got in the European election away, particularly at a general election when other issues count. Having said that, they have the infrastructure, they're picking up council seats and rebuilding after 2015 when they were wiped out after the coalition with the Conservatives. Joe Swinson will be a good leader. I think they will gain, at every general election, they'll gain Westminster seats, they'll gain council seats, they'll do well in Scotland, and they'll continue to develop. But they won't break through, by winning 80 seats. I just don't see that happening unless Labour doesn't adopt a Remain position and is either sat on the fence or Jeremy has some, dissertation of a European position to advocate at the general election. That's the only way I see them really making a mass breakthrough. But again, they could win, they're currently 11 seats. They could win 20 odd, which makes a difference. It makes a real difference because you look at the Southwest, where they've been historically strong, potential to win seats there is high, and at other areas. So I would suggest that they could double potentially the number of seats they have, if not more.
Hello, John. This has been fascinating to hear about what's happening with the political parties and your sort of description of the intricate details about parties. I just wanted to ask a question with the backdrop of people in business here are unable to plan their businesses in the way that they normally have done. And I just wanted to get a sense of what do politicians at the moment collectively think about this? Do they have a sense of that they're causing business to be in some sort of turmoil? So it's just, what's the sense of the politicians' view on at the moment?
Yes. Do they understand the impact on business? I think, yes, they do. I think some, let's put the ones who want a referendum and to remain, actually, that's their overriding objective. Those who want just to leave and no deal, that's their overriding objective. And they'll take, as Boris said to the Belgian ambassador, that's their attitude to business in the short term, particularly the CBI and the IOD. But yes, I think individual MPs do know the impact on business because they go back to the constituencies and they get it in the neck, when they are visiting businesses, going to constituency meetings on a Monday, Friday, and at the weekend. So yes, they do. But the overarching position is their personal desires to either get out or not to leave at all. It's the overarching position. But they know, in a funny way, and you'll have seen kind of spikes of demand as you prepared for the 31st of March, and you'll have suppliers looking at the 31st of October after they've worked through their 31st of March inventory, thinking, well, we have to do the same. And the honest answer is I think that will repeat itself, evidenced by some bigger clients like Glaxo, who want their suppliers to have 6 months stock to deal with the potential for a no deal. So I think we will see that sort of surge in orders and then drop off as they work through inventory if there's another delay. MPs do know it. Cabinet secretaries, permanent secretaries in the various departments understand the implications, and those papers are fed to the cabinet, so they understand it. But you look at the current cabinet, Theresa May's one, and there'll be, say, 6 or 7 there who would be happy to go on a no deal, not preferable, but would be happy to go on a no deal. 6 or 7 who that would be the last thing they would do, and they would basically vote to no confidence their own government rather than do that. So that's how the current Conservative Party's split. But they definitely understand the impact on business. I mean, luckily, we have full employment and the economy's okay. If we were to have a black swan moment, or there was, a Donald Trump moment in Iran and the world economy started to get buffeted, I think we'd be in big, big trouble. Well, thank you very much, everybody. So when you invite me back next year, and Jeremy Hunt is the Prime Minister and has successfully taken us out of the EU with Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, and that Jeremy Corbyn, resigned saying, I'm not the man to take Labour forward, and was replaced by David Miliband, you'll say, well, that John Arnold, he knows all. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good show.